I was standing in a church basement that smelled like burnt coffee and floor cleaner when my wife agreed that I no longer belonged in her family. She didn't say it out loud. She didn't need to. Her daughter had already done that part for her. "The most meaningful gift you could give us," her daughter said, voice calm, posture straight, wedding binder clutched against her chest like a shield, "would be for you to step away. Completely." The words landed softly. No yelling, no drama. Just a sentence spoken as if it had been rehearsed, refined, and approved. I waited. I waited for my wife to laugh. I waited for her to interrupt. I waited for her to say my name. She didn't. She simply nodded. A small nod, polite, almost regretful. That nod carried more weight than any argument ever could. 3 weeks later, they would be standing in that same basement with their voices raised, asking how everything had collapsed so fast. They would say they never saw it coming. They would swear it was an overreaction, a misunderstanding, a cruel coincidence. But in that moment, standing under flickering fluorescent lights beside a folding table stacked with pamphlets no one ever reads, I knew exactly what was happening. My name is Michael Harris. I was 58 years old that spring. For most of my life, I'd been the kind of man people relied on without ever really noticing. I worked as a commercial electrician, 36 years of early mornings, steel toe boots, and hands that never stopped humming even when I slept. I fixed what broke. I showed up when others didn't. I handled things quietly. That was my role. I met my wife, Elaine, later in life. She had already been worn down by a divorce that left her cautious and exhausted in ways she rarely admitted. She had one daughter, Sophie, who was 15 when I entered their world. I never tried to replace her father. I understood boundaries. I understood that some doors aren't meant to be forced open. Instead, I stayed useful, present, reliable. I picked Sophie up from school when Elaine worked late. I paid for driver's education and stood in an empty parking lot while Sophie learned to turn without panic. I showed up with jumper cables, late-night pharmacy runs, and steady patience. For a while, she called me Mike. Then briefly, she called me Dad. Eventually, she stopped calling me anything at all. Elaine and I bought a house together on a quiet street lined with maple trees and mailboxes shaped like small barns. We both signed the paperwork, but the down payment came from me. So did most of the repairs. The new furnace, the deck, the roof that needed replacing sooner than expected. I never kept score. I believed love meant contribution without expectation. Sophie's engagement changed the temperature of the house. Suddenly, every surface became a planning station. Color-coded binders, samples, timelines taped to the fridge. Elaine paced the kitchen on speakerphone, nodding and smiling, saying, "Of course, sweetheart," while Sophie spoke with the calm authority of someone used to being accommodated. Venues, caterers, floral arrangements, seating plans. I paid, quietly, without discussion. The meeting at the church was supposed to be routine. Final head count, seating logistics, who would walk where and when. Sophie stood at the front of the room, binder open, posture confident. She cleared her throat and said there was one more thing to address. "I don't want anything uncomfortable on my wedding day," she began. Elaine shifted in her chair. I recognized that shift. It was the one she made when she hoped a problem would resolve itself without her involvement. Sophie continued. "People might get confused. You know, about roles." I nodded once. "And honestly," she said, inhaling carefully, "it would mean a lot if you just stepped back." I waited. She swallowed. "The best gift would be for you to disappear from our family." Silence filled the room. A wall clock ticked louder than it should have. Someone shifted a folding chair. I looked at Elaine. 12 years of shared mornings, shared bills, shared silences. I searched her face for resistance, for surprise, for defense. She nodded. That was it. I didn't argue. I didn't ask questions. I didn't defend myself or list sacrifices or explain the years I'd quietly held things together. I simply said, "All right." That surprised them. That night, I packed a single duffel bag, work clothes, a toothbrush. I left everything else behind: the furniture I'd repaired, the photos I no longer felt part of, the house that suddenly felt like borrowed space. Elaine stood in the doorway while I packed. She said my name once, like she might say more. She didn't. I left my keys on the kitchen counter beside Sophie's wedding binder and slept in my truck behind a roadside diner, the smell of grease drifting through the cracked window. By morning, my phone was full of missed calls, confused messages, Sophie demanding to know what I thought I was doing, Elaine asking where I was. I didn't respond. I went to work. The world doesn't stop when your marriage ends. Wires still need pulling. Panels still need rewiring. At lunch, I sat in my truck and stared at the accounts on my phone, the mortgage, the insurance policies, the joint savings I'd managed for years without thinking much about it. Disappear, I thought. All right, but disappearing doesn't mean vanishing. It means stepping away carefully and letting the structure reveal what was actually holding it up. And that was when I realized something they hadn't. They didn't just ask me to leave. They asked me to stop carrying the weight they'd never acknowledged. And weight, once set down, always falls somewhere. I didn't have a plan when I drove away from the diner that morning. I didn't need one. For most of my life, plans had been something other people asked for after I'd already handled the problem. I just knew I wasn't going back to that house, not yet, maybe not ever. I spent the day doing what I always did. I climbed ladders, I pulled wire through concrete walls, I nodded when supervisors talked and answered questions with short sentences. My hands knew the work so well they moved without me asking them to. Strip, twist, cap, secure, repeat. There was comfort in that rhythm. Electricity obeys rules, people don't. By late afternoon, my phone buzzed again. Elaine. Then Sophie. Then Elaine again. I didn't open the messages. I didn't need to. I already knew what they said. Confusion first, then irritation, then fear, quiet at first, like something moving behind a wall. When my shift ended, I didn't drive home. I drove past the street once, slow enough to see the porch light flick on automatically, like it always did at dusk. Then I kept going. I ended up parked outside a credit union I'd been banking with since before Elaine and I ever met. Same brick building, same faded flag out front. Same bench by the door where people waited for rides or pretended not to smoke. I sat in the truck for a long time with the engine off, watching customers come and go. It felt strange, realizing how much of my life had been built on habits no one else noticed. I finally went inside. The air smelled like carpet cleaner and printer toner. A young teller smiled and asked how she could help. I told her I needed to review a few accounts, joint ones. She nodded, asked for my ID, and started typing. Everything felt ordinary. That was the unsettling part. No alarms, no questions, just numbers appearing on a screen, neat and obedient. Checking, savings. The account Sophie had been using for wedding expenses. I didn't close anything. Not yet. I asked questions, took notes, listened. When I stepped back outside, the sky had turned that flat gray that means rain later. I sat on the bench and watched a man struggle to get a stroller through the door while his partner laughed, half apologetic, half exhausted. Life moving forward, unaware. That night, I checked into an extended stay motel off the interstate. Beige walls, thin carpet, a bed that dipped in the middle. I lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to traffic hiss past the window, thinking about the house. The third stair that creaked, the way Elaine's shampoo lingered in the bathroom long after she left for work, the garage shelves I'd built on a Saturday when Sophie was still in high school. I slept badly. The next morning, I went back to the house while Elaine was at work. I still had a spare key. Walking inside felt like stepping into a staged home. Everything in its place, but none of it mine anymore. I packed a few more things. My toolbox. A framed photo of my father. The flannel jacket I wore every fall. I didn't touch anything that looked like a marriage. No albums, no shared mugs, no blankets chosen together. Sophie's wedding binder sat on the kitchen counter, exactly where I'd left it. Color tabs, sticky notes, timelines down to the minute. I closed it carefully, like it might bruise if I didn't. When Elaine got home that evening, my side of the closet was empty. She stood there with her arms crossed. "You're really doing this," she said. "I am. You're punishing us." I looked at her then, really looked, the lines around her mouth, the way she avoided my eyes. "No," I said. "I'm stepping back, like you wanted." She opened her mouth, then closed it. "Sophie didn't mean..." "She meant it," I said. "And you agreed." Something shifted in her expression. Not anger, not sadness, uncertainty. Like she'd finally realized something was moving that she couldn't stop. Over the next few days, the messages escalated. Sophie's voicemail swung from furious to panicked. "You can't just leave," she said in one. "Do you know how this looks?" Elaine's were quieter. "We can fix this. Please come home. You're hurting everyone." I didn't respond. Instead, I met with a realtor I'd known for years. His office smelled like burnt coffee and old paper. He flipped through documents, eyebrows lifting. "You're serious?" he asked. "I am." "Fast sale or clean?" "Clean." He nodded slowly. "You know what that means." "I do." Signing the listing agreement felt heavier than I expected. Not because I doubted it, but because it made everything real. The house would sell. The plans tied to it would unravel. I knew that. That night, Elaine showed up at the motel unannounced. She knocked until I opened the door. "You're tearing everything down," she said, eyes bright. "For what?" I didn't raise my voice. "For myself." She laughed, sharp and brittle. "You think this ends well?" "I think it ends," I said. The next morning, the for sale sign went up on the lawn. By afternoon, my phone exploded. Sophie screamed. Elaine cried. Someone from the wedding venue called, confused, asking who still had authority to approve events at the house. I let it ring. "Disappear," they'd said. I was doing exactly that quietly, legally, one piece at a time. And the more I stepped back, the more I noticed how much of their world had been resting on supports they'd never acknowledged. Payments, permissions, signatures, assumptions. By the end of the week, I understood something I hadn't when I first packed that duffel bag. Disappearing wasn't a single act. It wasn't slamming doors or dramatic speeches. It was a series of small absences, carefully placed, like removing nails one by one and waiting for the board to finally sag under its own weight. The house listing went live on a Thursday morning. Bright photos, wide angles, the lawn looked greener than I remembered. I stared at it longer than I expected, trying to feel something sharp: regret, satisfaction, anger. Mostly, I felt tired. That night, my phone buzzed again. "Elaine." "Sophie's in tears," the message read. "She says you're humiliating her." I set the phone face down on the table. For the first time since that church basement, my hands stopped shaking. Because now, whether they admitted it or not, the question had changed. It was no longer why I left. It was what, exactly, they would do without me. The first offer came in on a Tuesday morning. I was on a ladder inside an office building downtown, rewiring a lighting panel that hadn't been touched since the 90s. Fluorescent lights hummed above me, steady and indifferent. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I ignored it until the circuit was secured and my feet were back on solid ground. The realtor's name lit up the screen. "It's a little under asking," he said carefully, like he was approaching a skittish animal. "We can counter." "Accept it," I said. There was a pause. "You're sure?" "Yes." When I hung up, I leaned against the wall for a moment, breathing in the faint smell of dust and insulation. I expected to feel something sharp: panic, triumph, regret. Instead, what settled in my chest was finality, heavy but clean. That night, alone in the motel room, I thought about the spare bedroom closet. Sophie's wedding dress was still hanging there, untouched, waiting for a day that was quietly slipping further out of reach with every signature I signed. I didn't feel satisfaction imagining it, just distance, like looking at something through thick glass. By Wednesday, the tone of the messages had changed. Less anger, more urgency. The wedding venue left a voicemail, polite but strained, explaining there seemed to be some uncertainty regarding the property being used for the rehearsal dinner. Without confirmation from the homeowner and proof of insurance, they couldn't proceed. "There's no confusion," I said when I returned the call. "The house is being sold." Silence on the line. "I understand," the woman said finally. When I hung up, my hands were shaking, not with fear but with adrenaline, because now the consequences were moving beyond hurt feelings and angry words. Now they were real. I went back to work that afternoon, climbed another ladder, pulled more wire. My body knew what to do even when my mind didn't. During lunch, I sat in my truck with a dry sandwich and watched a young couple argue in the parking lot. The woman waved her arms. The man stared at the ground. I wondered which one I'd been all those years. That evening, Sophie texted me directly. "You're ruining everything. You always do this. You make it about you." I stared at the screen until the letters blurred. I thought about the night she'd called me from college, crying because her car wouldn't start. I'd driven 2 hours through a snowstorm without hesitation. "You're my hero," she'd said back then, half joking, half not. I didn't reply. Instead, I called my insurance agent and started making changes. Another thread loosened, quietly, deliberately. Elaine showed up at the motel again that night. This time, she didn't knock. She stood outside my truck in the parking lot while I sat behind the wheel with the engine off. "You're hurting her," she said through the open window. "I didn't start this," I replied. "You're her father." "I was," I said gently, "until I wasn't." Her mouth tightened. "You're enjoying this." I shook my head. "I'm surviving it." She leaned closer. "If you keep going, there's no coming back." I looked at her, then really looked. "You already decided that," I said. "You just didn't think I'd accept it." She stepped back like I'd pushed her. The sale closed the following Monday morning. I remember the sound the pen made when I signed the last page. A soft scratch, nothing dramatic. The realtor stacked the papers neatly and said, "That's it. 12 years of payments. 12 winters of shoveling. 12 summers of mowing the lawn," while Sophie sat on the porch, scrolling her phone, asking if I'd seen her sunglasses. I walked out into a parking lot full of ordinary cars. A minivan honked. Someone argued with their phone. Life kept moving, unaware that something I'd built no longer belonged to me. The calls started before I reached the end of the block. "What did you do?" Elaine demanded. "I sold the house." "You can't." "I did." She went quiet, then softer. "The venue just called. They canceled the rehearsal dinner. I figured they would. They said they can't proceed without the property." "I understand," I said. "You're destroying her dream." "No," I replied. "I'm stepping out of it." By afternoon, the dominoes fell fast. The florist, the band, the caterer asking who was now responsible for outstanding balances. I didn't answer. There was no confusion on my end. Sophie called from a number I didn't recognize. I answered before I could stop myself. "You sold the house?" she screamed. "Are you insane?" "I warned you I was disappearing," I said. "You did this on purpose." Yes, there it was. The truth, finally said out loud. "This isn't revenge," I continued. "It's consequences." She hung up. That evening, I went back to the house one last time while it was still empty. The buyers wouldn't take possession until Friday. The rooms echoed. The air smelled faintly of dust and lemon cleaner. I brought one box. Not heavy, just paper. I set it on the kitchen counter, right where Elaine used to lay out bills and Sophie spread her binders. The counter still had a faint scratch from the time I dropped a screwdriver years ago. I'd meant to sand it down, never got around to it. Inside the box was a single binder, black, thick, the kind accountants use. On the spine, in block letters, I'd written, "What disappears?" Inside were tabs, clean, labeled, mortgage payments, insurance, utilities, education, medical, wedding expenses, extras. No opinions, no accusations, just dates, amounts, copies of checks, statements, notes in my handwriting. On top of the binder, I placed an envelope addressed to Sophie. Not Elaine. Sophie. I stood there longer than I needed to. Long enough to hear a car pass outside. Long enough to feel the years settle into my shoulders. Then I left. I didn't tell anyone I'd been there. The call came that afternoon. It wasn't Elaine. It was Sophie's fiancé. "What is this?" he asked, voice tight. "Open it," I said. There was a pause, paper shifting, a sharp breath. "Did you know about all this?" he asked her. Silence. That silence was louder than anything she'd screamed before. By the time the sun went down that evening, the truth was no longer contained inside that house. It had begun to move. Not loudly, not dramatically, just the way real things do, quiet at first, then impossible to stop. I wasn't there when Sophie opened the binder. I only know what happened because silence has a way of carrying information better than shouting ever could. Her fiancé called me back less than an hour later. His voice sounded different. Not angry, not accusing, just stripped of certainty. "I didn't know," he said. "I know," I replied. There was movement on his end of the line, paper sliding, a drawer opening and closing. Somewhere in the background, I could hear Elaine crying. Sophie's voice rose sharp and panicked, accusing, overlapping itself. "This is manipulative," Sophie said loudly enough for me to hear. "He planned this." "I documented it," I said evenly. "There's a difference." No one answered that. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy, full, like a room where everyone has just realized the same uncomfortable thing at the same time. "What am I supposed to do with this?" her fiancé asked finally. "That's not my decision," I said. "It never was." The line went dead. Later, I learned what happened next from someone who had no reason to embellish. A neighbor. Someone I'd waved to for years without ever really speaking to. He told me Sophie had thrown the binder across the kitchen. Pages scattered across the floor. Numbers sliding out into the open like something alive. Her fiancé picked them up slowly, one by one, reading them even when she told him not to. The neighbors gathered not intentionally, not dramatically, just the way people do when something breaks in public. Pretending to check their phones, pretending to walk their dogs, pretending not to listen. Someone said, "I always thought he paid for everything." Someone else nodded. No one argued. By evening, the story had moved beyond the street. Church friends, wedding guests, people who had wondered why the wedding was suddenly postponed, why vendors were canceling, why the house was being sold so quickly. There was nothing to correct. The truth doesn't need defending once it's fully visible. Elaine called me late that night. Her voice sounded smaller than I'd ever heard it. "You've made your point," she said. "I didn't make a point," I replied. "I answered a request." She cried then, not loudly, just enough for me to hear the weight of it. "You didn't have to do it this way." I closed my eyes. "This is the way it was done," I said, quietly. "Over years." She didn't respond. The wedding was officially postponed the following Monday. Postponed, not canceled. As if time alone might soften numbers. As if waiting could somehow make facts less factual. Sophie posted a vague message online about toxic relationships and boundaries. It gathered sympathy quickly. It always does. But sympathy doesn't erase receipts. And it doesn't survive long when people start asking questions they didn't ask before. I didn't comment. I didn't respond. I didn't explain myself to anyone. I didn't need to. Because once the weight is set down, everyone can see its shape. Weeks passed. The house changed hands. New owners, new curtains. A child's bike left on the lawn one afternoon when I drove past without realizing I'd turned onto that street. I didn't stop. I moved out of the motel and into a small rental on the edge of town. One bedroom, thin walls, a porch just big enough for a chair and a cup of coffee. The first night there, I sat outside and listened to traffic hum like a distant river. No timelines, no binders, no voices negotiating around me. The quiet didn't feel empty. It felt earned. Work stayed steady. I woke up at 5:30 every morning out of habit, even when I didn't need to. My hands still buzzed at night, but I slept better than I had in years. No tension humming through the walls, just honest tiredness. One afternoon in October, a knock came at my door. It was the neighbor from my old street. "I hope this isn't strange," he said, shifting his weight. "I just wanted to say, people noticed." I waited. "Not the selling part," he clarified. "The other part, the truth." I nodded. "They don't talk about it much," he said, "but they noticed." After he left, I sat back down and looked out at the trees. For the first time, I understood something I'd been too busy to see before. Respect doesn't announce itself. It shows up quietly after everything else falls away. Elaine tried once more near Thanksgiving. She stood on my porch with her coat pulled tight, eyes tired. She looked past me into the small living room, the second-hand couch, the lamp I'd fixed myself, the space that belonged only to me. "I didn't think you'd really go through with it," she said. "I did. You seem different." "I am." She nodded, the same small nod. But this time, it didn't hurt. "I wish you'd fought harder," she said. "I did," I replied, quietly, "for years." She left without another word. That winter, I bought a place of my own, smaller than the old house, paid for outright. A modest porch, a yard just big enough to rake without cursing. The first night there, I sat outside with a mug of tea and watched the sun sink behind the trees. No applause, no audience, just quiet. And for the first time in a long time, That was enough. Spring came back quietly. No announcements, no milestones. Just a shift in the air that I noticed one morning, standing on my porch with a cup of coffee, watching a pair of robins argue over the same patch of grass. The sun sat a little higher. The cold loosened its grip. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was bracing for something. The silence in my life had changed. It wasn't the sharp, awkward quiet of loss anymore. It was steady, rhythmic. The kind that lets you hear your own thoughts without flinching. I filled my days with ordinary things. Work, groceries, fixing what needed fixing, letting what didn't matter stay broken. I heard about Sophie the way you hear about weather in a neighboring town, indirectly, through other people. Her wedding never got rescheduled. Some said it was postponed indefinitely. Others said it was over for good. I didn't ask which was true. I didn't need details to understand what had happened. Truth has weight. Once it's set down in the open, everyone has to decide whether they can carry it. Elaine never came by again. No calls, no messages, just distance. I assumed she was doing what she'd always done when things became uncomfortable, adjusting her life around an absence and convincing herself it had always been that way. I didn't resent her for it anymore. Resentment requires energy. I'd spent enough of that already. One afternoon, months later, I found myself driving past the old neighborhood without realizing it. Muscle memory took over before my mind caught up. The turn came easily, too easily. The house looked smaller than I remembered. Someone else's car sat in the driveway, different curtains in the windows. A child's scooter leaned against the porch railing. I didn't slow down. That was when it finally clicked. Disappearing had never been about erasing myself. It was about refusing to keep performing a role no one respected. I hadn't vanished. I hadn't hidden. I had simply stepped out of a story that no longer had room for me, and in doing so, I'd allowed the picture to show what it really was without me holding the frame together. That realization didn't come with fireworks. No swelling music, no sense of victory, just a quiet certainty. I used to believe strength was loud, that it had to announce itself, demand recognition, prove how much it had endured. I thought love meant staying longer than was comfortable, giving more than was returned, bending until someone finally noticed. But what I learned slowly, painfully, is that being unseen for years doesn't make you noble. It makes you invisible. And invisibility isn't something you owe anyone. The strongest thing I ever did wasn't walking away in anger. It was walking away without it, leaving facts behind, letting the truth speak for itself, trusting that I didn't need to explain my worth to people who had already decided what it was worth to them. I didn't disappear to punish anyone. I disappeared to survive. And in doing so, I took something with me that no one could take back. My time, my dignity, my voice even when I chose not to use it. Some evenings, I sit on my porch as the sun goes down and think about the man I was standing in that church basement months earlier, folding chairs stacked along the wall. Coffee gone cold on a plastic table, waiting without admitting it for someone to defend him. I wish I could tell that man something. That it's okay to stop waiting. That sometimes the most honest answer isn't an argument, or a plea, or a fight. Sometimes it's simply accepting what's being asked of you and responding in a way no one expects. Because choosing yourself doesn't always look brave from the outside. Sometimes it looks like silence, like distance, like stepping back and letting the weight fall where it always should have. If this story stirred something in you, if you've ever felt quietly erased, taken for granted, or asked to make yourself smaller so others could stay comfortable, know this. You're not weak for noticing, and you're not wrong for stepping away. So here's the question I'll leave you with. If you were asked to disappear from a life you've been holding together, would you walk away loudly burning bridges, demanding explanations, forcing acknowledgement? Or would you step back quietly and let the truth remain? If you believe disappearing can be an act of strength, comment 1. If you believe it's an act of self-respect, comment 0. I read every comment. And if stories like this matter to you, stories told without noise, without villains or heroes, just people finally choosing themselves, then stay a while. There are more coming. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do isn't proving how much you mattered. It's showing what vanishes when you're gone.